Hi, everybody. I'm Lindsay Reiser. We have been watching a CBS News special report. President Biden just held a solo press conference at the close of the NATO summit, calling the event a success and vowing to continue supporting Ukraine. He also fielded questions from the media as questions swirl about his candidacy. Biden said he is the most qualified person to run for president and that he beat Donald Trump once and he would do it again. The president went on to say he is here to finish the job he started. Biden did make a slip up when asked about his Vice President Kamala Harris. He mistakenly referred to her as Vice President Trump. Let's go to CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is at the Washington Convention Center where the president just held his press conference. Nancy, your first question to the president was about his legacy. Tell me about his response and what stood out to you.
Right, Lindsay. And the reason I asked him that specific question is because there are lawmakers who have been saying in recent days that they feel that Joe Biden's legacy is something he cares so much about. And they think that eventually if they urge him to think more about his legacy and how it could be hurt if he stays in the race, in their view, and ends up losing, as they fear he might, that perhaps that, more than anything else, will cause him to change course. So I asked him, has he thought about his legacy? Is he worried about what it would mean for his legacy if he stays in the race and ends up losing to someone who he has claimed is unfit to return to the Oval Office? And interestingly, he said he doesn't care about his legacy. And then he went into a long dissertation about everything that he's gotten accomplished in his first term, as if to make the case that that's the legacy that is really important to him. He also, Lindsay, throughout this press conference, tried to home in on the benefits of his age. We've been talking a lot in recent days about the challenges that his age poses for him. He talked about the fact that being 81 and being in public life as long as he has given him wisdom, has given him deep relationships that he has been able to tap into to get legislation passed, given him a longevity on the world stage as well, developing relationships with world leaders. Whether that's enough to quell the doubters remains to be seen. He was very fluid with foreign affairs throughout this press conference. The problem is that there are many lawmakers who have said, even if he does well tonight, they're worried that things might not go so well the next time. And so the challenge for the White House is trying to figure out how to change that dynamic.
And Nancy, the president mentioned the Vice President Kamala Harris would be ready to serve as president. You asked him about it. Let's listen.
What is it about her attributes and her accomplishments over the last 4 years that make her ready to serve on day one if necessary?
First of all, the way she's handled the issue of freedom of women's bodies to have control over their bodies. Secondly, her ability to handle almost any issue on the board. This was a hell of a prosecutor. She was a first-rate person, and in the Senate, she was really good. I wouldn't have picked her unless I thought she was qualified to be president.
Nancy, when you only have one or two questions to ask the president, I'm always curious, why that question? Why did you ask that, and what did you make of his response?
I asked that question, Lindsay, because obviously one of the big discussions here in Washington has been if President Biden were to step aside, would he hand the reins off to his vice president? Would he throw his support behind her? Is she the heir apparent if, in fact, he does bow to pressure from House and Senate Democrats who say he should leave the race? And so I was really curious to know how he views her accomplishments over the past 4 years, why he thinks that she is ready to serve on day one. And if he didn't have a ready answer for that question, why not? It turns out he did. He talked about the fact that she has sort of taken the lead within this administration when it comes to one of the biggest issues for Democrats, and that's reproductive rights. And he talked about the fact that even before she was his running mate, she was a very successful and well-respected prosecutor. Now, does that mean that he's ready to turn the reins over to her? Not necessarily. One thing I would have loved to ask him if I had the opportunity to ask a third question is, what will you do if the House and Senate Democratic leaders, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, come to you and tell you that a large number of their members, maybe a majority of their members, think you should step aside? What will President Biden do then? He certainly gave every indication in his answers to other questions that he is not reconsidering his decision. But, that could change if he gets evidence that he is losing the confidence and support of lawmakers in the House and Senate.
So let's go to CBS congressional correspondent Nikole Killion. Nikole, that said, let's go ahead and play what the president said about his ability to get legislation through Congress.
Can you name me somebody who's got more major piece of legislation passed in 3.5 years? I created 2,000 jobs this last week. So if I slow down, I can't get the job done. That's a sign that I shouldn't be doing it. But there's no indication of that yet. None.
I don't know if you're already hearing reaction from your sources, but was tonight enough to move the needle for members of Congress?
Well, it certainly wasn't enough for Connecticut Congressman Jim Himes, who, as soon as this press conference wrapped, released a statement calling on the president to step aside from his campaign, noting some of those very accomplishments we heard the president talk about in that soundbite. He says, "It has been the honor of my career to work with him on the achievements that secured his remarkable legacy in American history. It is because of those traits and in consideration of that legacy that I hope President Biden will step away from his presidential campaign, or from the presidential campaign." He goes on to call on the president to make way for a new generation of leaders. And I think, that is certainly something we continue to watch on Capitol Hill. We have seen this drip, drip, drip of statements from members now up to over a dozen. I think Jim Himes now makes 14. And so the question is, post-press conference, will the floodgates start to open? Yes, the president had incredible command when it came to the issue of foreign policy and other topics, but, it's these gaffes mixing up his vice president with former President Trump that, it is glaring for some members as they watch this unfold in real time. And, we continue to hear members say that they want to see more, but a lot of them were really watching this press conference tonight as something that could be influential in their decision as to whether they would stick with the president or not.
Joining us now is CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Margaret Brennan. Margaret is also the moderator of Face the Nation. So, Margaret, we did have some of those moments in which the president obviously touted extensive foreign policy information. It said one of the maybe most memorable lines of the night, "Control guns, not girls." But he also had those gaffes that we've been discussing tonight. He would sometimes trail off, saying a story, say anyway. What's your assessment?
Joe Biden has always been known for gaffes. It is the impression during that debate that raised concern that he didn't have control of facts or that he couldn't be quick on his feet and, in fact, seemed confused in the moment. Tonight, for the better part of an hour, he tried to demonstrate that's not the case. And so in many of these detailed answers, he seemed to be almost going to really leaning into the attempt to show that he had a grasp, particularly of what's happening inside Ukraine and the war with Russia. But he did have, as you say, not insignificant gaffes by inverting the names of Trump and his own vice president in answer to a question about her competency and ability to serve if needed. There were a few things like that. He claimed that his approval ratings were very high in Israel. He said Hamas had approval ratings in the West Bank that they don't. So there were a few things where he did flub, but this was really about reassuring many of the Democrats that we know had press statements prepared to be released when this ended. One of them you heard Nikole refer to. That's not insignificant to have the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee come out after 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, he told me on Face the Nation that, America's adversaries, he couldn't say how they responded or analyzed the situation, but he didn't think that 90-minute debate would be decisive. Well, tonight, he's saying it is, and that the president should not be at the top of the ticket.
What are your sources telling you about what happens in the next 24, 48 hours?
Well, we know that a number of lawmakers have been prepared to release statements saying that the president shouldn't be at the top of the ticket because of the risk to his legacy, they will argue. I will say if there's a common thread, many of them are in that national security space or have an insight into it, as Himes just laid out. Why is that important? Because we're talking about the commander-in-chief at a moment of global instability, at a time when China is on the march, when Russia is actively fighting and trying to seize land inside Ukraine, and we have this unrest in the Middle East and possibility of a new front. That is what President Biden likes to see as the thing that gives him strength here, the experience in the foreign policy space and the experience in the legislative space. But the idea that he could do this with the vigor needed for another 4 years, taking you to age 86, is what gives some of these lawmakers pause. And we know that there will be more coming out in the coming days.
Nancy Cordes, the next coming days is sort of the next week being defined by the next challenge. So the next one maybe being the NBC interview or the next public appearance.
Sure. He's got a campaign event tomorrow in Michigan. He's got that NBC interview on Monday. Hard to remember the last time he did 2 network interviews within the space of 2 weeks, but that's the pace we're looking at right now. He's got more events next week. He'll be traveling the country. And so what the White House is trying to do here, they know that the next batch of polling is going to start coming out post-debate, post-July 4th, and that's what all these Democratic lawmakers are going to be absorbing as they think about where they want to stand on his future. And so the White House is trying to make the case that he's inevitable. Look, he's already moving forward no matter what lawmakers say, and hoping that that's enough to keep lawmakers from coming out in greater numbers than they have already and calling on him to step aside. I think the big concern for this White House now is that they know, and Margaret has reported this, that there were a number of lawmakers who were just waiting for this NATO summit to conclude before coming out with those statements. They didn't want to embarrass him on the world stage. The former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi made it very clear she didn't think that that was appropriate. And so it's going to be a bit of a nail biter for the White House and the Biden campaign over the next 24 hours to see what House Democrats and Senate Democrats do now that this summit has concluded.
Margaret, what have we been hearing from some of the world leaders at the NATO summit in regards to their confidence in the president leading the nation and being such a leader in NATO?
Well, you know, this NATO summit was supposed to be celebrating the 75-year mark for this Western alliance, and was supposed to be the focus. And then it turned into, from a political perspective, a chance at redemption for Joe Biden to show that he is leading not only the United States, but he is leading Western democracy. What happened in a lot of these press conferences with world leaders, whether it was the French president or the German chancellor, is they were asked, so what was Joe Biden like in those meetings? And both Olaf Scholz of Germany, Emmanuel Macron of France have had to speak to that. And one reason is because you saw another gaffe earlier today where President Biden was introducing Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine and instead referred to him as Vladimir Putin, which is a significant inversion. He quickly caught himself, but you could see in the room a little bit of a stiffening of the spines, and Volodymyr Zelensky himself sort of laughed it off. But it is that quick on the feet aspect that it keeps just overshadowing what could be more of the foreign policy legacy President Biden would like us to be talking about. And it was interesting in that press conference how he came out right out of the gate, not saying the United States led, I led. I'm the one who declassified the intelligence to warn the world Vladimir Putin was about to invade. I did that. I made that call. There was a defense from the top to really project strength and to put that forward. And frankly, at times, it felt like he was using a lot of the talking points that he had prepared for the debate 2 weeks earlier and hadn't quite gotten to.
And Nikole, we also heard the president attack quite a great deal former President Trump, say, where has he been, riding around in his golf cart, filling out his scorecard, talking about what he would do to NATO and his threats to withdraw, or the Biden saying that, he would just let Putin do whatever he wanted. But Republicans are already seizing on some of the gaps we heard tonight.
Well, they certainly are. I mean, straight out of the gate, they took issue with, again, the president confusing his own Vice President Kamala Harris with former President Trump, with the House Republicans putting out publicly on their Twitter or X post, the Vice President is not President Trump, or President Trump is not the Vice President. So they were quick to seize on that, as have many throughout the Republican Party. But I do want to go back to, some of the things that the president said in terms of trying to make the argument to congressional Democrats. He was very clear, not only in discussing his age, saying with age comes wisdom, but also being clear that, look, I get politics. If, they want to run away from me, they can. So, I don't know that it's enough to convince him to get out of the race. He understands the dynamics of, particularly for these Democrats who may be in very tight races, whether that's in the Senate or in some of these frontline districts, that he gets those dynamics that, look, if you want to keep your distance from me, I understand that. Now, clearly, that may not stop the floodgates potentially. However, I think he is trying to make the point that if you're not with me, that's not necessarily going to stop me. And I think he tried to make that point in different ways, whether that was arguing, look, if we go to the convention, how are you going to start up the operation from scratch? We have a robust campaign, also making the case for continuing to do the job, trying to remind people why he got in this race to begin with. So certainly the president was very clear about trying to forcefully make his case as to why he should stay in the race. And so, quite frankly, even if we see more statements come out, whether that's over the next 24, 48, 72 hours, I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be enough to convince him.
Nikole, Killion, Nancy Cordes, and Margaret, Brennan, thank you all so much.